In urban environments, poverty and homelessness can be evident at street level, but in rural Ontario, those facing tough times can be much harder to see. COVID-19 has made that more difficult and essential to address, as the gaps between services and people can be life-altering. Joining us now as part of our collaboration with the Rural Ontario Municipal Association during their 2021 annual conference in the provincial capital, Elizabeth McIsaac, president of Maitri, a charitable foundation focused on human rights and poverty in Canada. Welcome. It's very nice to meet you, Elizabeth.
Thank you. A pleasure to be here.
What a year it's been. For months, there's been a lot of talk about post-pandemic economic recovery. What do you feel has been missing from that conversation?
Well, I think we're so caught up with where we are at the moment. I think there are certainly, I think of economists like Armin Yalnizyan, who has so very rightly talked about a she-covery and coined that phrase. And I think what's important about that is really drawing our attention to those who have been most impacted, most severely impacted, and those who were already in a position of vulnerability, of difficulty in terms of precarity of work, underpaid work conditions, and those types of things going into the pandemic. And so, I mean, it's become, I think, almost cliche at this point that we talk about the COVID has, put all of the cracks in our system under a spotlight, and has revealed just how bad things are. But what we really need to talk about, and again, we've said it over and over, let's build back better. But what does that mean,
Mhm.
and what is that actually going to take? And I think that's where we really need to get into. What does that involve?
Mhm.
What are the values that are implied in that? And how do we guide that? How do we govern that process of building back better so that we don't just repeat the same things? Because the decisions we've made in public policy have been guided by certain imperatives and pressures. And so I think really being conscious of what values we want to guide recovery will be critical.
And we're going to talk more about building back better and what that entails. But you don't think that we need to divorce economic recovery and human recovery. Is that correct?
I think they're hand in hand. I think that
In
as we
what
talk
ways?
about Well, as we talk about economic recovery, we're going to see investments. We're going to see significant investments once we start to see stimulus funds flowing. And that's going to be once we get over this hump. We're still in the middle of things. But when that happens, when we stimulate the economy, we need to do it in such a way that people who are getting the jobs in the kinds of jobs that they're able to do, that they're going to have training to do, that those are going to be jobs that have decent conditions attached to them. So we've made, some fatal errors in our economy around precarious work, and we've seen the fallout from that. We've seen the fallout from not giving people sick days. We've seen the fallout from not paying people enough so that they have security. And so as we think about the new jobs that are coming and how we're going to shape that, that has to be part and parcel of the conversation.
What is a human rights-based approach to recovery?
So this is work that we've been doing. I'm at a private foundation that is interested in poverty and human rights. And so we've recently been thinking about what does a human rights community, a human rights city, and we're talking about rural Ontario. So what does it mean for local government when we think about human rights? And a human rights recovery for us is really about the planning, the decision making that is going to happen, the priorities that are going to be set, and using a human rights lens for that. And I'm not just talking about non-discrimination, although that is paramount and so important, but it's also about the realization of social and economic rights. Are we ensuring that we are providing access to affordable housing? Are we providing jobs that have decent work conditions? Are we, all those social and economic rights, work, health, education, housing, food security, how are those being planned for at a local level, and that we're building people who are going to be impacted by it into the decision making? Really key. Are people who are impacted involved?
I think it's safe to say that when we think about human rights, oftentimes we think of it through the lens of federal government and maybe not municipalities. In what ways are local governments positioned to advocate for those rights?
So local governments make a lot of decisions that impact people's lives. And in fact, many of our rights are realized or not realized or violated at a local level. It's things like housing, it's affordable housing, it's homelessness, it is food security. These things happen in our communities, in our towns, our cities, our communities. And local governments have a whole bunch of tools available to them. They are making decisions all the time, whether it's in designing buildings, in investing. They're going to be getting infrastructure dollars coming down from the federal government. How is that going to be deployed? How do they do procurement of services? Are they attaching to the procurement of services that the city or the town commissions? Are they putting attached to that human rights conditions? They have the ability to affect all kinds of planning and design decisions using a human rights approach. They're also closest to the people. They're not just social actors, they're not just economic actors locally, they're also democratic actors. So the extent to which they are bringing the community, the local residents into decision making is part of this.
So when we think about how this human rights approach might work, let's talk about rural Ontario and an example of migrant workers. What sort of conditions have some of these workers in southwestern Ontario been dealing with during this pandemic?
So we all saw the news over the course of the summer and into the fall, of migrant workers who, one, were in living conditions that were far below what anyone would feel comfortable seeing their own family living in. We saw workers that were not being allowed to leave the farm. They had different, perhaps, mobility rights being given to them by their employers. We saw workers who were afraid to speak out because their work is contingent on the employer that they're working for. So there's a built-in power relationship where it's very difficult for them to claim their rights to speak out about things. We also saw 30 outbreaks on some of the farms across Ontario. So it was really a terrible tragedy of how that played out for these workers who are very vulnerable in terms of their rights. And I think that this is a great example of it takes all orders of government to find solutions on this, because this is a program designed by the federal government. There's levels of provincial regulation involved in it, and then there's local communities who are dealing with the fallout of it. And the impact of it, and then there's the private sector, the farmers themselves, and so that's an example where there was a number of different players. The ones who had no voice were the workers themselves, and so that's the opposite of human rights approach.
Do you think that part of what's missing is the education component of people knowing what their rights are?
That's a big part of it. When we talk about a rights-based approach, we talk about promoting human rights, which is about ensuring that people are educated about it, understand what their rights are. But you also need to have places where they can claim those rights, where they can come forward and raise issues. And if that's not in place, then the other is meaningless. But we also talk about protecting human rights, which is the duty on the part of government to ensure that another actor, a business, a private sector or other, isn't violating the rights of a person.
Mm.
And then there's also the third part, which is the obligation of states to fulfill, to ensure that their rights are being realized. And that's where the government has to come in and do their part to make sure that the workers' rights are being protected and realized.
So moving forward, how could a human rights-based approach change the working conditions for migrant workers?
I think that goes back into the policy design of how we're looking at temporary foreign workers, of seasonal workers that are coming into Canada. I think there's been, and this is another example of, a policy that has been challenged for being flawed in terms of the rights that workers have for many years. It's not new. It's been decades that we've had this program in place. It's decades of insufficient housing arrangements being provided, insufficient inspection, insufficient rights, where a worker can be sent back if they're fired by their employer because they are entirely subject to that employer. So great vulnerability. So it goes back up into the policy. How are we going to do that policy? And I think the federal government has work to do there. And I think that local governments can be really important advocates, both around the importance of these farmers being supported to increase the quality of what they are offering their workers, also holding employers to account, but ensuring that, and there was an example, I think, of one mayor might have been Norfolk County, but really spoke out about the impact this has on the community. That people were looking at, migrant workers and with fear that they were carrying the virus. Well, they were like everybody else, but it sparks the wrong reaction. And so the leadership, I think, from mayors, from political leaders in our local communities, is so important to set the tone that these are human rights, that we respect that.
We're living in such a strange time, and there's so many industries that are competing with one another for resources. Do you worry that people might hear human rights and then dismiss it as being too idealistic of an approach?
I think people do get their backs up with when you talk about human rights. That this is people are claiming things, and all of a sudden, do I have to give everybody a job? Does everybody get a house? And that's actually not what it's about. And so we do have a lot of education to do around this. When we talk about a human rights approach, it's about putting people at the center. It's recognizing what rights of theirs a policy needs to address, that the goal needs to be. How are we going to move the marker forward? It's something called progressive realization, that we're going to continue moving forward, but measure ourselves against it and ensure and be accountable to seeing things go forward, not backward. That's what we mean by it. And so I don't think there's something to be afraid of. In fact, I think there's something to embrace, because when we do it and when we do it right, we actually end up having better outcomes, and we'll end up having communities with greater resilience, less homelessness, better economic productivity, and less cost to public services, because people will be able to find economic opportunity. They'll be housed. We'll have a different set of engagement by people in the community, as opposed to being pushed out. And we know this. We know that when people are on the outside, it creates negative impact right around. And so it is in everyone's best interest, in
Um,
fact, to
uh,
see this.
well, the pandemic has exposed a lot of things in society that have been there, but maybe we didn't want to look at before. And now we're forced to look at. The Liberal government has vowed to build back better, and you mentioned that earlier. What other groups do we need to pay attention to, especially in rural Ontario, if we're going to build back better?
So I think there's the usual groups of people who are excluded, who have not had the benefit of what society is offering. So I think women are a big group. We know that they are disproportionately impacted in the workplace, and so they are a group that needs to be considered. And I think that some of the work that has happened around that is really important. I think people with that are working for accessibility, whose disabilities perhaps prevent them from gaining access to some of the opportunities that they should have access to, are a group we really need to be attentive to, because that is another example of a group that was disproportionately impacted by COVID, and we want to make sure that we don't repeat that in the build back. We know that racialized communities have been significantly impacted. I live in Toronto, but it's not just a Toronto issue. The Black community was significantly impacted, not only by COVID, but also by other issues of anti-Black racism in the community. And so all of these communities have to be at top of mind, Indigenous communities top of mind, as we build back, that we're building a community and a society that is respectful of all. And so I also think of groups like those who are currently without homes, the homelessness, and that is across Ontario. That is in small town, big city. Homelessness is part of our reality. And so, how do we ensure that the build back is ensuring access to affordable housing, that we're building affordable housing, and that people have access to it?
When the Ontario government issued its latest preventative measures to try and contain the spread of COVID-19, it was criticized for not including sick days for employees as part of its plan. How could the omission of sick days affect the province's recovery efforts?
I mean, we're seeing it now. I mean, the fact that the spread of the virus is I think it's kind of accepted. This is a direct result and impact of people not being able to call in sick, and those who don't have sick days. And let's be clear, there are certain jobs where you have sick days, and there are certain jobs where you don't. And so, by allowing part of the sector of the employment sector to not provide sick days, to not allow people to have that time to, if they're sick, to to isolate, to take care of themselves. People have really compelling reasons to show up for work. It's rent, it's food on the table, it's their children in front of them. And so unless we work together, and I think there's ideas that are moving around about government working with private sector to figure out how that happens both in the short term, but then let's build it into longer term public policy that is sustainable, that will protect workers in an ongoing way. Until and unless we have that, we will simply be vulnerable to the same results again.
Would you argue that sick days should be considered a human rights?
I believe they are part of the right to work. Right to work includes decent work. The International Labor Organization has dug into this. There are all kinds of things around fair wages. And I think and sick days being part of that. We need to be able to call in sick. The remuneration is up to be figured out and negotiated. But protecting the job and having some payment there to allow people to call in sick. I think if there's one takeaway from this pandemic, that's got to be it.
If you were to lay out a human-centered pandemic recovery plan for rural Ontario, what would the priorities be?
So I would, with priorities, I always think of what's available, what's under your jurisdiction, what do local authorities have available to them, and I think that there are the things that we've talked a little bit about, and as the build back for local communities comes, there will be investments being made. Use the tools they have, and so I think that things like using social procurement, there will be, if money is coming in for infrastructure projects, look at how to do community benefits. Look at how you
What do you
can
mean by
negotiate
that,
better
community
terms.
benefits? Sorry.
So community benefit agreements are something that have begun to be used around big infrastructure programs, around projects, both in the U.S. and Canada and more broadly. And what it does is communities come together to define the outcomes, the social benefits that they want for the community. So that if you're building a football stadium, if you're building a hockey arena, if you are building a new bridge, what are the benefits that are going to come with that? If Because that's a lot of money coming into the community. Is it going to move out across who's getting the jobs? What kind of training is available for those jobs? Are there other built environment things that will come from that you can negotiate in as part of the deal? Private sector contractors are going to make a lot of money from this. So, what are the benefits that are going to reside in the community and stay in the community? And that's what you negotiate through a community benefit agreement. And so, I think that that's a tool that local municipalities should look at. Local municipalities have lots of control over all kinds of procurement. Let's make sure that that those companies that you're hiring to do work for you are paying people a fair wage, are providing sick days, are applying a human rights lens, are ensuring that there is equity and inclusion across, and non-discrimination. So those are pieces that cities have control over. But I think the first step,
Mm.
cities, communities, towns, there's an opportunity to state, to formally recognize what are the values that are going to guide our process. What are we going to be a human rights community, and how do we recognize that? Do we have an articulated statement of what that means for us, and then what is our plan to achieve it?
And I think for a lot of people who live in urban areas, when they hear rural community, they assume it's just one community. How important is it when we do have these discussions for us to acknowledge the diversity in those rural communities?
It's critical, and that's why I can't lay out a single roadmap of this is what it looks like, or what are the priorities, because every community needs to do that inward look of what are the priorities in our community. Is it our relationships with surrounding Indigenous communities to this local municipality? Do we have real resource, or resource extraction issues in our community, and how do we manage that? Are we a conduit to an international border, and what does that mean for the work we do? Are we a farming community? Are we surrounded by, and what does that mean for our priorities? So it does have to be very, I think, specific to the location,
Mhm.
but the principles and the tools, I think, are very generalizable.
So when we talk about the recovery priorities, who needs to be working together and how to tackle this?
So beginning from the community itself, I think that the leadership comes from the political leadership. I think that if this is a priority for them, there needs to be a political statement around that, a recognition that these are the values that are going to guide us. There's going to be pressure. And we know this is coming. We know that in the next 10 years, we're going to see austerity measures. We have spent a lot of money as a country in the last 10 months. We're going to spend more in the coming year. And then there's going to be We know that that's coming down the road. And so I think the pushback has to be, what are the values that are guiding us? Are we being guided by fiscal imperatives, by balancing budgets at certain timelines? Are we being guided by the most important thing, which is the human dignity of each person in our community? And how do we move the marker toward that?
Elizabeth, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate your insights. Thank you for being on the agenda.
Thank you for the opportunity.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.